Hello, good morning, and welcome to Wednesday's Politics at Sam and Anne's, the podcast that brings you everything you need to know about the day ahead in British politics in under 20 minutes.
It's Wednesday, March the 12th, and since yesterday, the US has hit the UK with tariffs. That all happened at 4 a.m. We now have a possible peace deal in Ukraine. Farmers are crying betrayal once more over a sudden ending of a subsidy scheme. Meanwhile, almost every Labour MP is heading to number 10 to talk welfare cuts. And cabinet ministers have broken a taboo by discussing Rachel Reeves' fiscal rules in front of her. At least that's according to an extraordinary leaked account of this week's cabinet by Channel 4's Gary Gibbon. Worth a watch. We're all going to try and find out more about that. I suppose the big picture, the big question today is really, are 2025's political leaders actually in the driving seat of what they're doing? How much are they simply passengers in the tumult? As ever, joining me to discuss that and everything else is Anne McElvoy of Politico, and my name is Sam Coates of Sky News.
In the last couple of hours, the Business Secretary, Jonathan Reynolds, has issued a statement saying he's disappointed with Donald Trump's administration after it levied 25% tariffs overnight on all steel and all aluminium imports, including those coming into the UK. And those came into force just a few hours after Keir Starmer was heaping praise on President Trump for a remarkable breakthrough after Ukraine signed up to a 30-day ceasefire plan. And I think that just goes to show, Sam, as you suggest, these helter-skelter events, at the moment, they're not in any way aligned with each other.
No, we often talk about split-screen moments in this podcast. Two completely different challenges for Keir Starmer when it comes to US relations. There is just no playbook for how you deal with a White House like this. But I think we need to start with the breaking story overnight. It's a complicated story. Often people in Westminster find the issue of tariffs slightly out of their comfort zone. So let's try and explain as clearly as possible what's going on and what the consequences are. So about a month ago, President Trump announced that he'd be introducing more tariffs, specifically on steel and aluminium entering the US. Doesn't matter where it was going to come from. Any of those goods were facing a 25% tariffs. Now, at 4 a.m. this morning, his promise turned into reality. That is a big moment. It means that the UK is now caught up in a trade war with the US. We had hoped that there'd be some kind of carve out for the UK. That hasn't come about. All the arguments that were carefully prepared by Keir Starmer and Peter Mandelson about how our steel wasn't a threat to US steel, how the volumes weren't very huge, how we're allies, they all fell on deaf ears. And, you know, that attempt by Keir Starmer, one of his big aims when he went to Washington a couple of weeks ago, was to stop this, and it hasn't worked. So ministers scrambling to respond to that, and we'll talk a bit more about the UK response in a moment. But just before I throw over to you, I just want to give you a tiny bit of history, because this is what Donald Trump did in 2018 when he came in the first time. There were tariffs on steel and aluminium, including that from the UK. But in the years that followed, we and the EU did a deal, and we were able to negotiate partial exemptions. So what's been going on overnight effectively is slapping tariffs once more on the US's allies, because the tariffs still applied to countries that never did deals like Vietnam and Turkey. So what's happened overnight is really only the US's friends have been hurt by what's happening, or their traditional allies, because their enemies or countries they weren't close to already had the tariffs on them. And the final thing to say is that unlike 2018, we are going to respond differently to the EU. Back then, we were still in the customs union, even though we had that Brexit vote. So when the Europe retaliate with their own tariffs back, tit-for-tat tariffs, we will choose to do things differently, and we're taking that option. So whilst I'm sure Donald Trump will be extremely stung by Jonathan Reynolds' stiffly worded 4-paragraph statement, he's more likely to focus on the 20 billion of tariffs that are about to be slapped by the EU on US goods entering the European Union from April the 1st.
Friends is an interesting category, isn't it, when dealing with the Trump White House? I think it could feel more like frenemy status. And the exam question that follows up on what you've laid out there, Sam, is really how far does the UK now go in response? Because we're getting a lot of insight, and I completely agree at that 2018, there's a sort of sense of Donald Trump really now doubling down on his very strong belief in tariffs as something that the US can and should wield in the international system. He genuinely believes the US has been shortchanged, particularly in dealings with China, but also in Europe. And we've seen that very strong response there from Europe. Ursula von der Leyen will be around and about this morning, but the response has already been clear that there are going to be reciprocal tariffs targeting that 18 billion euro or so worth of American goods which come under tariffs now. And the EU is saying, well, you know, if what goes around comes around on that front, don't make us do this. Donald seems to be the message, but we are going to respond. Now, we're not seeing that in the UK. We have the, as you put it, stiffly worded 4 paragraphs, which is a long way from being reciprocal when it comes to tariffs. So we seem to be trying a softly approach, definitely diverging there, no question, from the EU. My Playbook colleague, Dan Bloom, he hears that when we're talking about broader transatlantic relationships, which we're going to do in a minute, David Lammy, Foreign Secretary, and Marco Rubio, I think there's a desire to keep the UK very engaged with all of the parties in the US. And I imagine that the aim there, as well as talking about Ukraine and Russia and the role of the UK there, is to be able to get some messages through about tariffs during a kind of brush by, because they are in touch by phone. So if you like, the UK's call me, we'll call you, and the EU's like, okay, enough talking, we now have to move to reciprocal measures. That's going to be a really interesting one in terms of our relationships with Europe as well as our relationships with America.
Absolutely. The bleed of what Europe chooses to do into subjects like Ukraine is going to be fascinating this weekend, and we'll come on to that in just a second. But this is an important domestic story for a couple of reasons. First of all, there is a fear that additional tariffs being levied on goods will have an impact on the global economy. It'll just make the dash for growth harder for Keir Starmer. But nowhere is there a greater problem, quite obviously, than in the UK steel industry, which often feels like it's already on its knees. And we're looking at tariffs being imposed on what's effectively 7% of our steel exports. By volume, it's 9% by value. And the steel industry is anticipating a direct hit, a direct reduction in the amount of sales to the US as a result of these tariffs. But it's also concerned about something else, which is, if it is more expensive for the UK and everybody else to sell steel into the UK, what that's going to mean is that outside of the US, there's just going to be a glut of steel on the global market. And that is going to mean that prices drop. And that is going to mean even more problems for the industry, because prices are going to go down, rewards are less, and then the industry is even less viable than it was already. So it's a really particularly bleak moment for what we have in the past thought of as a key industry. There's now a question about whether or not we think we should have our own big steel industry, or whether we should just import things for renewables and big industry from places like China. That's a big strategic question. And this government looks like it's leaning into, let's just get it from China as an option. So they're all turning to the government and going, okay, so if you're not going to fight the tariffs, you're not going to hit back tit for tat, and that may well be sensible given the way that Donald Trump responds and did respond, for instance, to Canada. What are you going to do for us? And that will be set out, I think, in about a month's time. There is a UK steel strategy being drawn up by the business department by Jonathan Reynolds. And all of that is the question. The thing that they're begging for in the steel industry is help with energy prices and electricity prices. Because, as we know, they're higher in the UK than they are pretty much anywhere else. And steel is incredibly energy intensive industry. So that's the kind of thing that the industry is looking for a bit of help from government as a sort of quid pro quo, you know, as this element of global diplomacy or undiplomacy ends up hurting them.
And an interesting, I must say tension, but I think there's a different lens between, say, the MOD here and business, basically the department, but also the idea of sort of, well, you can just get it off the peg from China if you could get steel off the peg, but you know what I mean. And I think I was talking to someone there, a very highly placed official, who was saying at the same time as we're talking about how would we deal with a possible peacekeeping force, well, we also know we're going to need to keep supplying some form of defensive capability, and that we're going to raise defence spending. Well, you'd expect some of that, quite a lot of that, will end up coming back to the steel industry. So do we really want to have a strategic objective which bigs up Britain in the picture of supporting peacekeeping to try and keep the Russia-Ukraine conflict now sort of tamp it down and at least be able to monitor it? But you can only really do that with strength if you look like you are a properly armed power. And then, do you really want to get that mainly from China? So I think this strategic idea about steel has become very interesting to me ideologically, that it used to really come from the left, didn't it? It was the sort of left to say, we've got to have steel, we've got to do this ourselves, we don't make anything anymore kind of vibe. But now you also see a lot of defence hawks saying, hang on a minute, this is really important strategically for reasons that are not just to do with business.
This government is making a massive bet on the US and China. It's basically betting that over the course of Donald Trump's premiership, he is not going to give in to the China hawks around him and start being incredibly aggressive towards any ally that does business with China and start to try and force them to stop. Because the UK government's going pretty all in with China. There's another delegation with Metro Mayors and the rest going out next week. I think Ed Miliband is going to go out at some point. You've obviously had Rachel Reeves out there, David Lammy out there, and we've probably got a visit with Keir Starmer. But if the China hawks on the Hill in the US to get Donald Trump to turn the screw, and suddenly all of those kind of, containers full of Chinese steel are no longer able to come to the UK, there's a problem, and there's a real and urgent problem in how we do, how we make things, how we build things, and quite how we deal with our economy, because the government's going one way, but it's not clear yet that it's sustainable.
And the big story adjacent to this that involves the US, Britain, all the great powers, is that Russia-Ukraine proposed ceasefire deal. Not yet anywhere near a peace deal, but a ceasefire. Do you want to tell us the difference and what you make of it?
Yeah, let's just go through the basics since the last time I spoke to you, which wasn't that long ago. Right, so the breakthrough yesterday evening came when Ukraine and President Zelensky endorsed the American proposal for a 30-day ceasefire. And as a kind of quid pro quo for President Zelensky doing that, President Trump invited him to the White House and said that he was going to lift the freeze on military aid and intelligence from going to Ukraine. President Trump and his allies and his cabinet have now challenged Russia to do the same, to sign up to the 30-day ceasefire. And essentially, we await Moscow's reaction. That's the next thing that we need to see. And in the sidelines of this, Keir Starmer is trying to use his status and that little bit of goodwill that he'll have with Donald Trump for perhaps not retaliating on tariffs, to reconvene European leaders on Saturday to discuss the response of Ukraine's allies. Effectively, this will be Lancaster House 2.0, except this time I suppose we know it's going to be virtual. It's going to be over Zoom, or do world leaders use Zoom, or do they use Teams? Anne? You'd know that.
I wish I did know that. I think they did. You remember
that? They can get in touch.
There was some sort of platform, and I probably shouldn't name it, that they did use, in which all the major talks, including on Ukraine defence, leaked in Germany. So they don't use that one anymore. Which I have to say, I mean, I shouldn't laugh about something so serious. But if you've ever had problems with your tech at home, listeners, and platforms when you're getting into a work call, can you imagine what that must have been like? So yeah, they used something with a fair bit of security on it, put it that way. I think that the main thing that has happened at those talks in Jeddah was that Ukraine was basically being shaken down and told that it has to agree to something pretty fast. So we've seen quite a change there in tone and acceptance from the Ukrainian delegation after it was badly humiliated, or Zelensky was badly humiliated in the White House. But I think also what we're seeing is Ukraine very much with the active support of Number 10, of Jonathan Powell as the National Security Advisor, who now seems to be completely just involved with Ukraine advisory service, really, to try to get the best out of this ceasefire deal. Why do I keep saying ceasefire? And a lot of people are saying, we're not anywhere near a truce yet, but people are talking about a peace deal. I think what Jonathan Powell has been saying, and seems to be very now accepted by Ukraine, is that talk about a ceasefire, talk about very concrete terms, talk about 30 days now, don't talk about beyond that, don't go into the European security architecture, the risks to Ukraine and how bad and sad this all is. Just put something in front of Vladimir Putin and see what he does. The ball is in his court, as Marco Rubio says. And I think that's been quite carefully orchestrated, that the sense that now it's up to the Kremlin to respond. Now, I read the Kremlin website, so you don't have to.
Of course you do.
Of course I do.
Of course you do. And of course, for those listeners that don't know, spent a long chunk of her career in Moscow. So she is a very credible Russia expert. So what's going on in Russian on the Kremlin website?
Well, I thought you might like to know that there's nothing going on the Kremlin website about this. And the lead is on a food and agri deal with Uzbekistan. And that is, and then it gets more interesting from there. There's a lot about butter quotas as well. So one of sorry, I feel I may have gone off piece, so I will come back. But it is relevant, Sam, because what you're seeing here is that Russia, that there are reasons why it's not on the Kremlin website, and that is Russia saying, okay, we will take our time here. There's a pace of events. A little bit, I'm beginning to sense competition between America and Russia, between Moscow and Washington on the comms of this. Yeah, okay, you've put forward a ceasefire. We'll get round to it when we want to get round to it. And in the meantime, we're looking at our domestic concerns. So that's quite interesting that we've heard Rubio saying ball is in Putin's court. We will hear a response from the Kremlin, but there's none of that sense that you get from the US of haste, is there? This morning when we were all running around here in Europe and the US, and it's bang, 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 one announcement and proposal after another, and Putin's, just let me sort out my my deal with Uzbekistan, and then I'll get back to you. So I think it'd be interesting. I think a US official told Politico and doubtless others, it's still about 50% how Putin responds to this. Does he decide that his interests are in waiting even longer? Or at that point, I think things would start to get pretty touchy with Donald Trump.
I'm really struck in your explanation, Anne, of this idea of really quite sophisticated political tactics at work in the negotiation, and this idea of just putting the notion of a 30-day ceasefire in front of President Putin and challenge him to respond. It almost feels quite British politics-y, if I could say that. But that leads me to quite a big thing that's going on, because for the first time that I can really remember in Keir Starmer's premiership, Number 10 are really keen to sort of slightly shepherd this story and tell you a number of things about it. And I haven't come across this until this moment, and they're being unusually helpful trying to sort of curate the story on their side, and all credit to them, and I actually think it's a good thing to do, and we will always relay it faithfully when they give it to us, as well as comment on it, and it's not their normal style, but it goes like this. First of all, they want to make clear that Britain is intimately involved. Look, I mean, you've got to give that to them. Keir Starmer is convening all of these summits and clearly is involved. But the second thing, and you were onto this before anybody else, Anne, is the role of Jonathan Powell. Now, he's Keir Starmer's national security advisor, and, they want us to know that Powell was working with Mike Waltz all weekend in the prep for the Jeddah meeting alongside the French and the Germans. He's meeting, and as you told the world first, he was meeting Andrei Yermak, the chief of staff to Zelensky, in the run-up to yesterday. And now we understand that Powell's going to Washington on Friday for more meetings with Waltz. And I think that one of the points here is, yes, there is a character called David Lammy, who happens to be the Foreign Secretary, who has some meetings too, as you were saying. But number 10 is casting Jonathan Powell as a central character. So just note that they are happy to have his name in lights. But there's a third thing. Listeners to this podcast will know who Jonathan Powell is. He was Blair's longtime chief of staff, veteran of lots of diplomatic discussions, but particularly the Northern Ireland peace plan. And I mention that because I'm looking at the kind of the intel that we've got about how they're structuring the peace deal in Ukraine. And it involves stages and it involves different goals, confidence building measures. There are bits on the detained civilians and the return of children, the exchange of prisoners of war and staged processes. All of this has all the hallmarks of professionals that have done peace negotiations in the past, and nobody has done that more and more successfully than Jonathan Powell. What we are seeing feels to me very reminiscent of somebody with an enormous amount of experience of what happened in Northern Ireland.
And who since has basically had a business in conflict resolution, dealing with the most intractable of places where he's been involved with everything from sort of Syria to Burma, etc. So also he's very used to dealing with kind of very difficult, not to say impossible, people on the other side of the table. And there I think you can see that impact. I don't want to sort of say the whole of Ukraine's pivot is about that relationship, but it does seem to have created a very different tone. And what's so clever, I think, about it is that you've got to push towards Moscow now. If you keep saying, like, is this bad for Ukraine and how does Ukraine fit into the European defence system, in a way you just keep raising the pressure on Ukraine, and they're not getting as much help from the US as they probably deserve or should have. But that is the reality, and that seems to be the big shift that we've seen. Interesting, and you mentioned it, it was at the back of my mind, but you just bring me to when you talk about what's the role of David Lammy here. Then it does sound almost like he's kind of chief diplomat in all of this. You know, he's still got good connections to the US. He worked very hard on that with the Trump administration, to give him due credit. But when push comes to shove, this is being brought back to where big decisions about peace and war are made, and that is in number 10. Also means, of course, the risk rises for number 10 if it doesn't go according to plan.
We've gone over time. Partly because I pressed pause on the timer so we could just get a little bit more on Jonathan Powell into this podcast.
That's a cheat. You can't cheat the clock.
I can, and I do, and I've done it before, and I'll do it again. However, we've broken our promise to do it all in under 20 minutes. The noise that you might have heard halfway through this podcast was the cat, Bob, sneezing. So on that note, I'm going to say thank you very much indeed, and we will be back tomorrow morning for Thursday, the last one of the week's Politics at Sam and Anne. See you then.
Bye, Sam, and bye, Bob.
The world is becoming increasingly complex and volatile. How can we make sense of it all?
I'm Richard Engel.
And I'm Yalda Hakim.
And we present Sky News' latest podcast, The World. Each week, we'll cut through the noise to guide you through the week's global events and explain to you why what happens out there matters to you wherever you are.
We're on the ground in some of the world's toughest places. Listen now to The World with Richard Engel and me, Yalda Hakim, wherever you get your podcasts.